So, what do you know about Sodom and Gomorrah? The very mention of those two words, which are actually names of ancient biblical cities, often strikes disgust and contempt in the minds of most listeners, though few are actually able to accurately articulate what it is about those biblical stories that was such a hallmark of human depravity and sexual crime. In popular imagination, we might know a few things, but can rarely tell the whole story. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Torah is far more complex and more nuanced than its reputation suggests, and it's what, the Torah portion at least, is what we read tomorrow morning in synagogue. But we often skip that part of the story because we've got the binding of Isaac earlier on, and that's sort of more of a highlight. While if the near sacrifice of a child can be more of a highlight than the near destruction of two cities for moral depravity, whatever. So while these cities are indeed destroyed for their wickedness, the narrative does not hinge solely on sexual misconduct. Instead, the text actually highlights themes of injustice and cruelty and a profound lack of hospitality, which is a fundamental sin in ancient Near East culture and, of course, in Jewish tradition. The people of Sodom were condemned for their harsh treatment of the vulnerable, their failure to uphold justice, and their refusal to care for strangers and the needy in a city whose streets, the Torah tells us, was paved with gold, a city of abundance filled with riches. As articulated by the prophet Ezekiel, the sin of Sodom was pride. The sin of Sodom was overindulgence. And the sin of Sodom was neglect of the poor and the oppressed. And this broadens the moral scope of the story, shifting its focus from individual transgressions, from those acts of sexual crimes that we snickered about in religious school and Hebrew school, to systemic societal failings, which nobody can laugh at. At its core, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah invites us to reflect not just on our personal morality, but on collective responsibility. Collective responsibility for creating a just and compassionate society, which was lacking in Sodom and Gomorrah. This past month, I have been reading Rabbi Sharon Brous' book, The Amen Effect. We had a book club discussion about it last night with about 18 people. It was a fantastic discussion where we talked about the core themes from her short but very impactful book. And whether you were able to attend the discussion or not, I encourage you to download or to get the book from the library or to purchase it. Early in the book, in the third chapter or so, a chapter called See No Strangers, she writes maybe the most accessible and illustrative description of the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah that I have ever encountered. And so I want to read it to you in its entirety. It's just a couple of paragraphs in Rabbi Brous' words. She begins, Sodom and Gomorrah were abundant in natural resources, blooming oases in the middle of the desert. These lands were so rich with vegetation, it is said that bread emerged from the earth in Sodom with the dust of gold upon it. But as often happens, the city's natural abundance fueled a spirit of scarcity among their inhabitants who sought to safeguard their riches. Outsiders will only try to divest us of what is rightfully ours. Come, they plotted, let us eradicate foreigners from our land. And so they did. They forcibly deported foreigners and sealed off their borders. Maybe you're seeing a theme here. They shared with no one. But it was not enough to criminalize outsiders, those who sought a better life in their midst. They also ruthlessly targeted their own poor. They already, back then, their xenophobia was matched by their misogyny. They not only lied and cheated and stole from the most vulnerable, but they took sadistic pleasure in violating and dehumanizing women. In Sodom and Gomorrah, the people's worst inclinations were propped up by a legal system that supported it. A high court comprised of habitual liars, perverters of justice. Lawmakers passed zero-tolerance policies that meted out torture to anyone who exhibited the slightest compassion for a struggling neighbor. In Sodom, it was decreed, whoever hands a piece of bread to a pauper or a stranger shall be burned at the stake. It was a law in Sodom. Rabbi Brous observes that these rulings read like ideological precursors to the Fugitive Slave Acts in the United States in the 1793 and 1850, which imposed harsh punishments not only on enslaved people who attempted to escape, but also on anyone assisting fugitives. And centuries later, to the Nazi laws, threatening the death penalty to anyone who provided safe haven, food, or transport to Jews. Laws like these, of course, fueled a culture in ancient times, as they do in modern times to this day, of distrust, betrayal, and callousness. The past reads like the present. Neighbor against neighbor, a cynical, concerted legal effort to quash human goodness. Abraham's nephew Lot lived in one of those terrible cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He was, as the story goes, an unremarkable fellow. Not great, not terrible. On one hand, he didn't share the depravity of his neighbors, but he seemed to have no problem living in their midst, and like so many living in unjust societies, he just kept his head down and his mouth shut in the face of their ruthlessness, the corruption, and violence. But Lot had a daughter, and her name was Plotit, who wasn't at all like her father. She saw every person as an image of God, B'Tselem Elohim, an image of the divine. So when she once came across a poor person starving on the street, naturally her soul ached and her heart wept. She knew well the danger of compassion in her society, but she also understood that she had to do something to help. She quietly conceived of a way to sneak food to this poor man each day when she went out to draw water, taking great care not to be noticed. But over time, the people of Sodom, who took pleasure in watching this poor man suffer every single day, they grew suspicious. Surely he should have died from hunger by now. How is he even still alive? And they realized that someone must be helping him, a traitor who had broken the covenant of cruelty that bound the citizens of Sodom one to the other. And so they set up a surveillance, and they surveilled the man, and they witnessed Plotit bringing him bread. Because feeding the poor was an act of criminality warranting the death penalty, the people of Sodom prepared to burn Plotit to death. Now, Brous comments in the midst of her retelling to say, I wish that I could say that there was some heroic intercession, some divine or human that entered in to save this gentle soul. But the story goes that Lot's daughter, Plotit, was marched into the town square for a public execution. A warning to others who might be tempted to open their hearts to someone in need. Better to close the shutters than get involved in these uncomfortable matters, they reasoned. And in her final moments before her execution, Plotit wailed, she cried out, and it was a terrible and anguished cry that echoed across the land. A cry so piercing that God could not ignore it. And according to the Midrash, it was this cry that ultimately sealed the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not the actions of the sinners, but the cry of the tzaddikim, the cry of the righteous. Her cry symbolized the breaking point of divine patience with the city as it revealed the extreme inhumanity of its residents and their punishment of kindness as a crime. They made kindness a crime. It is said that if we listen deeply, we can still hear the echoes of Plotit's cry to this day. And read through the rabbinic lens, Rabbi Brous points out that this story is a warning shot throughout the ages. It implores us to take note. She says, this is what happens when we fail to see the image of God in our neighbor, when we forget that we are each other's keepers. And so the next time someone references the story of Sodom and Gomorrah using it as an unclarified example of sexual depravity, I hope that you will remember enough of this story to correct them. It's a story of depravity and immorality, for sure, but not because of its salaciousness alone. Rather, because of its inhumanity, its cruelty, and the absence of all human compassion. And sadly, we live in a world where Plotit's cry can still be heard. in the desperate pleas of refugees at sealed borders, in the quiet despair of the unhoused, and the anguished voices of those seeking justice in an unjust system. These cries, they rise up, not only to God, but also to us, and they demand our response. They ask us, will we close our curtains? Will we turn off our porch lights and remain indifferent to the people of Sodom? Or will we, like Plotit, risk stepping out of the shadows to act with compassion, even when it is costly, even when it might be dangerous to ourselves? The Midrash doesn't tell us that Plotit's actions saved her life, but it does tell us that her voice saved the world. Her courage to defy the law of cruelty and her willingness to stand in solidarity with the vulnerable was what ultimately brought about divine intervention. And in this, Plotit teaches us an eternal truth that we need to learn again and again. That even when it feels like the deck is stacked against justice, the smallest acts of goodness and kindness, they matter. They matter profoundly. Rabbi Brous writes about the way that cultures of cruelty insulate themselves, using fear and punishment to create complicity. The people of Sodom didn't just commit acts of violence, they codified those acts of violence. They made them legitimate. They made them legal. They made cruelty a civic virtue, and they enshrined it in law. And yet, even in the midst of such a society, there was a Plotit, a young woman who believed in something greater. And her quiet, defiant love was not enough to save her life, but it was enough to break God's silence. And so we have a choice to make every day about the kind of world, the nation, province, city, and community that we want to help create. Will we participate in systems that strip others of dignity, or will we create systems that uplift? Will we stand by and watch as the vulnerable are exploited here and abroad, or will we risk stepping forward to protect and to help those who, like us, are broken, but B'Tselem Elohim, human, created in God's image, still reflections of God in the world? Now, I have no illusions that the growing political, social, economic, cultural, and moral divide that is sweeping the globe will be arrested by one sermon from a rabbi in Vancouver, or even a few acts of kindness by moral communities such as our own. The forces aligned against the values that Plotit ultimately gave her life for, they are strong, they are ever present, and sadly, right now, they are winning. The dam has burst, and there is a flood of hate and grievance running through the streets of the world. We need only look to Amsterdam to see that example, to say nothing of our campuses here in British Columbia, across our country. But, and that little three-letter word is doing a lot right now, but the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, reframed through Plotit's cry, it implores us, if only for the sake of her memory, to align ourselves not with Lot's silent complacence, but with Plotit's courageous defiance. The rabbis teach it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. May her cry be a wake-up call to rouse us from our dejection and our complacency. If we believe, as our Torah teaches, that saving one life saves the entire world, then we have worlds to save. And let us say, as Plotit's actions declared loudly, let it begin with each of us. Let it begin with me. Shabbat Shalom.
Peace will come, and let it begin with me. Peace will come, and let it begin with me. We need peace, and let it begin with me. We need peace, and let it begin with me. Oh, my own life is all I can hope to control. Oh, let my life be lived for the good of my soul. Let it bring peace, sweet peace. Peace will come, and let it begin with me. Peace will come, and let it begin with me.
We planned that.